A White House janitor emptied Franklin Roosevelt's personal wastebasket every morning for 2 years. He collected classified documents marked for destruction. He photographed them in a bathroom stall using a German Minox camera no bigger than a cigarette lighter. Then he walked out through security checkpoints while guards smiled and nodded. Nobody suspected the quiet Austrian refugee. Nobody checked his pockets. By the time the Federal Bureau of Investigation identified him as Agent 7 in 1945, he had vanished like smoke. The file sat sealed for 52 years. How many other spies do you think walked the White House halls during the war? People we never caught. People whose names died with them. Write your thoughts in the comments. The manila folder arrived at the National Archives reading room on a Tuesday morning in January 1997. A researcher doing routine work on declassified Federal Bureau documents almost missed it. The tab read, Household Security Assessment, Confidential, with a date stamp from August 1944. Inside were 37 pages that should never have been declassified. Someone in the bureaucratic chain had made a mistake. The pages described a German intelligence operation so brazen that J. Edgar Hoover himself ordered the entire investigation buried. Not just classified, buried. The spy's personnel file listed him as Wilhelm Schneider, naturalized American citizen, arrived from Vienna in March 1938 with a Jewish refugee visa. His background check showed a clean record. His references came from a Lutheran church in Queens and a settlement house in Manhattan that helped displaced persons find work. He spoke English with a slight accent that sounded educated rather than threatening. He could read and write. He had basic mechanical skills. Most importantly, he needed work and asked for very little money. The White House hiring office brought him on in June 1942 as a maintenance assistant. His job was simple: empty trash bins, deliver interdepartmental mail, replace light bulbs, keep the service corridors clean. For the first 3 months, Schneider did exactly what they hired him to do. He arrived early. He worked late. He never complained. Other household staff noticed he volunteered for weekend shifts when the building was quieter. He took on extra duties without asking for overtime pay. His supervisor wrote a positive evaluation in September 1942. Reliable, trustworthy, almost invisible. But Wilhelm Schneider was not his real name. The man had never lived in Vienna. His refugee visa was genuine, but it belonged to an actual Wilhelm Schneider who died of pneumonia in a New York charity hospital 3 weeks after arriving in America. Someone had stolen the dead man's papers and assumed his identity with enough skill to fool background investigators. The real spy had trained at a German intelligence school outside Hamburg before the war. He spoke 5 languages. He knew American culture from studying at Columbia University in the 1930s under a different identity. He understood how bureaucracies worked. He knew that invisible people with menial jobs could access places that mattered. The White House in 1942 was not the fortress it would later become. Security focused on threats from outside. Guards watched the gates. Secret Service agents protected the president during public appearances. But inside the building, hundreds of people worked in kitchens, offices, mail rooms, and maintenance shops. Many were new hires brought on to handle the wartime expansion of staff and operations. Nobody had time to watch the janitors. Agent 7, as German intelligence designated him in their communications, understood this perfectly. His training taught him that the best intelligence came not from dramatic theft, but from patient collection of small things nobody missed. He never tried to enter the Oval Office. He never attempted to photograph documents from the president's desk. Instead, he targeted the waste streams. Every day, dozens of offices generated classified paperwork. Secretaries made typing errors and threw away drafts. Aides received multiple copies of memoranda and discarded extras. Analysts prepared reports that went through several revisions, with each old version headed for destruction. All of this paper passed through trash bins that someone had to empty. The Minox camera became his most valuable tool. German intelligence had developed the tiny precision instrument specifically for espionage work. The camera measured less than 4 inches long and weighed under 5 ounces. It could photograph documents at close range with remarkable clarity. Agent 7 carried it in a specially modified cigarette case that allowed him to photograph papers without removing the camera. He worked quickly. A full document took less than 30 seconds. He never kept the papers. He photographed them right in the bathroom stall and then put them back in the trash bin to be burned with the rest of the day's classified waste. His methodology was simple but devastatingly effective. Each morning he collected trash from offices throughout the West Wing administrative areas. He sorted through the papers in a service closet, looking for anything marked classified or containing military information. When he found something useful, he took it to a specific bathroom on the second floor that senior staff rarely used. The bathroom stall had a small shelf where he could lay documents flat. He photographed each page. Then he returned the papers to his trash cart and continued his rounds. By the time the classified waste reached the incinerator in the basement, everything looked undisturbed. The intelligence hall was extraordinary. Agent 7 photographed portions of war production schedules showing how many tanks, aircraft, and ships American factories would deliver over the coming months. He captured memoranda about Allied shipping routes and convoy timing. He obtained early drafts of operational plans that revealed where American forces would deploy. He even photographed fragments of correspondence between Roosevelt and Churchill that discussed strategic priorities. None of it was complete. No single document told the whole story. But German intelligence analysts in Berlin could piece together the fragments into a remarkably accurate picture of American capabilities and intentions. Getting the intelligence out of the country required a separate network. Agent 7 never met his handlers directly. Instead, he used a system of dead drops in New York City. Every 2 weeks, he took the train from Washington to visit his supposed relatives in Queens. He carried the exposed microfilm in a hollowed-out tube of shaving cream. In New York, he left the tube in a specific men's room stall at Grand Central Terminal. Another agent collected it hours later. The film traveled through a chain of German-American sympathizers who still believed Hitler would win the war. Eventually, it reached a diplomat at a neutral embassy who included it in the protected diplomatic pouch to Buenos Aires. From Argentina, German intelligence couriers forwarded it to Berlin. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had no idea any of this was happening. Their counterintelligence efforts in 1942 and 1943 focused on known German agents and suspected saboteurs. They watched people with obvious connections to Germany. They monitored German-American organizations. They investigated industrial facilities where sabotage might occur. But they did not suspect the household staff inside the White House. Those people had been vetted. Those people had references. Those people were just trying to earn a living in difficult times. The first hint that something was wrong came from an unexpected source. British intelligence intercepted a German military message in April 1944 that referenced detailed information about American industrial production. The message was decoded at Bletchley Park as part of the regular traffic analysis. What caught the attention of a young analyst was not the information itself, but the level of detail. The Germans knew not just approximate production figures, but specific monthly outputs from individual factory complexes. That kind of precision suggested a source with access to actual planning documents, not just public information or estimates. The British passed the intercept to their American liaison officers with a quiet suggestion. Someone inside the American government apparatus might be leaking classified economic data. The Federal Bureau received the warning in May 1944. J. Edgar Hoover assigned a small team to investigate possible security breaches in war production offices. The investigation moved slowly at first. Hundreds of people had access to production figures. The team started interviewing staff and checking document handling procedures at the War Production Board. While investigators chased leads through bureaucratic offices, Agent 7 continued his work at the White House. He had no idea that British code breakers had detected his intelligence in German communications. He had no idea that investigators were beginning to map how classified information might flow from Washington to Berlin. He simply kept doing what he had done successfully for 2 years. Empty the trash, photograph the useful papers, take the film to New York, return to work. But in June 1944, something changed in his routine that later investigators would identify as the beginning of his undoing. A new security officer joined the White House staff as part of a general tightening of procedures after the D-Day invasion. The officer's job was to review document destruction protocols and ensure classified material was being properly handled. He was a former Army captain named Edmund Hartley, who had worked in military intelligence before an injury sent him to desk duty. Hartley had a careful, methodical mind. He liked to understand systems. He liked to spot patterns. Hartley spent his first 2 weeks simply observing how the White House handled classified documents. He noticed that different offices had different procedures. Some burned their waste immediately. Others let it accumulate for a day or two. Some staffers tore up sensitive papers before throwing them away. Others just tossed them in the bin intact. The inconsistency bothered him. He decided to track the waste flow from generation to destruction and identify weak points. One morning in early July, Hartley followed the maintenance staff on their rounds. He wanted to see exactly how trash moved through the building. He watched Wilhelm Schneider collect bins from various offices, dump the contents into a larger cart, and wheel the cart toward the service areas. Nothing seemed unusual, but Hartley was thorough. He asked Schneider questions about the routine. How long did it take to collect all the trash? Which offices generated the most paper? Where did the cart go between floors? Schneider answered politely. He had answered such questions before from other curious staffers. He gave the same practiced responses that made him seem like an ordinary worker who just wanted to do his job. Hartley thanked him and moved on. But something nagged at the captain's mind. The maintenance man's English was too good. The accent was there, yes, but the vocabulary and sentence structure seemed educated. This was not an unskilled laborer speaking broken English. This was someone who understood how to sound subservient while saying very little of substance. Hartley made a mental note to check the personnel files later. 2 weeks passed. Hartley reviewed Schneider's file and found nothing suspicious. The background check had cleared him in 1942. His work evaluations were satisfactory. His references checked out. But Hartley was a man who trusted patterns more than paperwork. He decided to watch Schneider's routine more carefully. Not obviously, just periodic observations to see if anything felt wrong. On the morning of July 27, 1944, Hartley positioned himself in a second-floor corridor where he could observe without being seen. He watched Schneider collect trash from offices and sort through papers in the service closet. The maintenance man seemed to be looking for something specific among the waste. He would pull out certain papers, glance at them, and set them aside. Then he took those papers and walked down the hall toward a bathroom that staff rarely used. He was inside for approximately 4 minutes. When he emerged, he returned to the service closet with the same papers and put them back in the trash cart. Then he continued his rounds as if nothing had happened. Hartley waited until Schneider had moved to another floor. Then he entered the bathroom and searched the stall. He found nothing unusual at first, but when he examined the small shelf mounted on the wall, he noticed something odd. The shelf had faint scratches in a specific pattern, as if something with metal edges had been placed there repeatedly. The scratches formed a rectangle about 4 inches by 6 inches, the size of a document or a folder. The captain reported his observations to the Federal Bureau liaison officer that same afternoon. He did not accuse Schneider of anything specific. He simply noted the unusual behavior and the physical evidence that suggested someone was using that bathroom stall for purposes beyond its intended function. The Bureau took the report seriously enough to assign 2 agents to conduct discreet surveillance. For 3 days, agents watched Wilhelm Schneider's movements inside the White House. They documented his routine in careful detail: empty trash at 0700 hours, sort papers in the service closet, visit the second-floor bathroom around 0830, spend 3 to 5 minutes inside, return papers to trash cart, complete rounds by 0900. The pattern repeated every morning with minimal variation. The agents photographed Schneider entering and leaving the bathroom. They documented the timing, but they had no legal authority to search him or seize his property without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. The breakthrough came on August 2nd. One of the surveillance agents entered the bathroom immediately after Schneider left. The agent searched the stall thoroughly. Behind the toilet tank, wedged into a gap between the porcelain and the wall, He found a small metal object wrapped in tissue paper. He carefully extracted it. It was a Minox camera loaded with film. Someone had hidden it there temporarily, probably planning to retrieve it after completing their rounds. The agent photographed the camera in place, then returned it to its hiding spot. He reported the discovery to his supervisor within the hour. Now the Bureau had physical evidence that someone was using that bathroom to photograph documents. The question was whether that someone was Wilhelm Schneider or another person entirely. They needed to catch whoever retrieved the camera. The surveillance continued. Agents watched the bathroom from a concealed position. On August 3rd, Wilhelm Schneider entered the bathroom during his usual morning routine. This time, agents had positioned a second officer inside an adjacent maintenance closet with a view through a partially open door. The officer watched through the crack as Schneider entered the stall, retrieved something from behind the toilet tank, and slipped it into his pocket. The officer could not see exactly what the object was, but the location matched where the camera had been hidden. Federal Bureau agents arrested Wilhelm Schneider 40 minutes later as he left the White House grounds at the end of his shift. They took him to a field office for questioning. A search of his person revealed the Minox camera, exposed microfilm showing photographed documents, and a hollowed-out tube of shaving cream designed to conceal film. They also found a train ticket to New York dated for the following day. Everything fit the pattern of espionage activity. Schneider said nothing during the initial interrogation. He invoked his right to remain silent and asked for a lawyer. Federal agents spent the next 72 hours building a case while keeping the arrest completely secret. They did not want to alert other members of Schneider's network that the Bureau had found their White House source. They needed time to identify his contacts and map the intelligence pipeline. The microfilm from Schneider's camera provided damning evidence. When developed, it contained photographs of classified memoranda from the War Department, shipping schedules from the Office of Strategic Services, and production figures from war industries. Some of the documents bore stamps indicating they originated from offices in the White House complex. Others came from different government buildings, suggesting Schneider had access to more than just White House waste. How he obtained materials from other locations remained unclear. Interrogators pressed Schneider for information about his handlers and his network. He refused to cooperate. He admitted nothing. He claimed he was being framed. He suggested the camera had been planted. His story made no sense given the evidence, but he stuck to it with remarkable consistency. The agents realized they were dealing with a trained operative who knew how to resist interrogation. J. Edgar Hoover personally reviewed the case file on August 7th. He immediately understood the political implications. A German spy had been operating inside the White House for 2 years. The spy had photographed classified documents related to war planning and production. Some of that intelligence had reached Berlin and possibly influenced German military decisions. The security failure was catastrophic. If news of the breach became public, it would undermine confidence in the government's ability to protect secrets. It would raise questions about how many other spies might be operating undetected. It would become a propaganda victory for Germany. Hoover made a decision that would haunt the Bureau for decades. He ordered the Schneider case sealed under national security classification. No public announcement of the arrest, no trial, no disclosure of the security breach. Instead, Schneider would be held in secret detention while investigators attempted to roll up his network. The official record would show that Wilhelm Schneider, maintenance worker, had resigned his position for personal reasons and left Washington. His personnel file would be purged. His background check documents would be destroyed. The investigation would continue in absolute silence. But the investigators faced an immediate problem. They needed to identify Schneider's contacts without revealing that the White House source had been compromised. If they arrested his New York connections too quickly, other members of the network would disappear. The Bureau decided to let the next scheduled dead drop proceed under surveillance. Schneider was supposed to travel to New York on August 4th. Agents would substitute one of their own people to make the drop and see who collected the package. The plan fell apart within hours. On the morning of August 4th, as Bureau agents prepared to execute the surveillance operation in New York, they received word that 3 people connected to German-American organizations in Queens had died overnight. 1 in a house fire, 1 in a traffic accident, 1 from an apparent heart attack. All 3 had been under loose Bureau surveillance as potential sympathizers. All 3 deaths occurred within a 6-hour window. The timing was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Someone inside the German intelligence network had learned about Schneider's arrest. Someone had ordered the immediate liquidation of anyone who might connect to him. The efficiency and speed of the response shocked Bureau investigators. It suggested the German intelligence services had their own sources inside American security agencies, sources that could detect when an arrest occurred and trigger emergency protocols. The dead drop in Grand Central Terminal went unwatched. Nobody came to collect the package that day or the next. The Bureau had lost their chance to map the network. Schneider remained in detention, still refusing to talk. His true identity remained unknown. The fingerprints on file did not match any records in German intelligence documents captured earlier in the war. His photographs did not appear in any known intelligence agency files. Whoever he really was, he had successfully erased his previous existence. Hoover ordered the investigation to continue, but leads evaporated. The Bureau traced the hollowed shaving cream tube to a specific manufacturer in Switzerland, but the company had no records of unusual orders. They analyzed the Minox camera and confirmed it was German-made, but thousands of similar cameras existed. They interviewed everyone who had worked with Schneider at the White House. Nobody remembered anything suspicious. He had been perfectly forgettable, perfectly invisible. By September 1944, the investigation had stalled completely. Schneider remained in secret detention at an undisclosed facility. He received no visitors. He had no contact with the outside world. Interrogators tried every technique available to them, stopping just short of physical torture. Schneider gave them nothing. He seemed to have accepted that his war was over, and his only remaining duty was silence. Then something unexpected happened. On October 12, 1944, Bureau agents guarding Schneider's cell found him dead. The official report stated heart failure. He was 41 years old, with no history of heart problems. The facility doctor who examined the body noted nothing unusual. The death certificate listed natural causes, but the interrogators who had worked with Schneider knew better. Cyanide capsules were standard issue for deep-covered German agents. Schneider had somehow concealed one through multiple searches and waited for the right moment. He had denied the Bureau their last chance to learn anything useful. His body was cremated without ceremony. The ashes were scattered at an undisclosed location. No death notice appeared in any newspaper. Wilhelm Schneider simply ceased to exist in all official records. The Federal Bureau continued investigating his network for another 6 months, but found nothing. The trail had gone completely cold. J. Edgar Hoover wrote a classified memorandum to President Roosevelt in December 1944. The memo confirmed that a German intelligence operative had infiltrated the White House household staff. The memo stated that the spy had been identified and neutralized. The memo recommended a complete security review of all government facilities, but the memo did not mention that the spy had died in custody. It did not mention that his true identity remained unknown. It did not mention that his network had successfully escaped detection. Hoover understood that some truths were too dangerous to acknowledge, even in classified communications. The White House implemented new security procedures in early 1945. Background checks became more thorough. Document destruction protocols were standardized. Household staff positions were reviewed, and several long-term employees were quietly transferred to other agencies. But nobody publicly explained why these changes were happening. The official story was simply that wartime security required constant vigilance. The real reason stayed buried in files that few people were authorized to read. After the war ended, American intelligence agencies captured German military records from various archives. Analysts searched for references to Agent 7. They found several encrypted messages that mentioned a White House source but provided no identifying details. They found reports containing information that could only have come from inside the American government. But they found no personnel files, no training records, no true name. The Germans had kept their source's identity so compartmentalized that even their own records revealed nothing useful. The mystery deepened when Soviet archives began opening in the 1990s. Some captured German intelligence documents had ended up in Moscow. American researchers examined these files, hoping to finally learn who Agent 7 really was. Instead, they discovered that Soviet intelligence had also been trying to identify him. The Soviets suspected the Germans had a source inside the White House and wanted to know who it was, so they could either turn him or eliminate him. They never succeeded. Even the formidable Soviet intelligence apparatus could not unmask Agent 7. 3 men who worked in White House household positions during the war years died under different identities between 1946 and 1952. One died in Cleveland under the name Herman Fisher, supposedly a retired factory worker. One died in San Francisco under the name Walter Braun, supposedly a merchant marine. One died in Miami under the name Otto Kraus, supposedly a hotel manager. All 3 had arrived in their respective cities shortly after the war ended. All 3 had minimal documentation of their lives before 1945. All 3 were cremated at their request, leaving no remains for later identification. Federal Bureau investigators quietly examined all three cases decades later when the files were declassified. They concluded that any of the three could have been Agent 7 living under another stolen identity, or none of them could have been. The evidence was circumstantial and insufficient. The Bureau had no way to prove that Wilhelm Schneider, whoever he really was, had died in their custody in October 1944. It was possible he had somehow faked his death and escaped. It was possible another prisoner had been substituted. It was possible the body in the crematorium was not Schneider at all. The truth died with everyone who knew it. German intelligence officers who might have identified Agent 7 were themselves killed during the war or executed afterward. The handful of American officials who read the classified reports took their knowledge to the grave. Even J. Edgar Hoover's private files, opened after his death, contained nothing more than what was already in the official case folder. What remains certain is that Agent 7 operated successfully for approximately 2 years. He photographed classified American documents in the heart of the White House. He passed intelligence to Berlin that gave German planners insight into Allied capabilities and intentions. He was detected only through a combination of British code-breaking, careful observation by a security officer, and Bureau surveillance. Even then, he revealed nothing under interrogation and died before he could be properly tried. His network escaped completely. His true identity remains unknown. The 1997 declassification brought the case into public view for the first time. Historians and researchers began investigating what could be learned 50 years after the fact. They interviewed retired Federal Bureau agents who had worked on similar cases. They searched for surviving records in various archives. They found fragments and hints, but nothing conclusive. Agent 7 had become a ghost, a shadow in history, a reminder that wartime Washington had been penetrated by an intelligence operative skilled enough to operate undetected for years. Some researchers believe that Agent 7 was not working alone inside the White House. They point to the breadth of information he collected as evidence that he had help from other sources. One janitor could access only certain offices and certain types of waste. But the intelligence he provided came from multiple departments across several buildings. This suggests either he had accomplices or he had developed techniques for accessing materials beyond his normal duties. The truth may never be known. Other researchers focus on how Agent 7 escaped detection for so long. They note that the Federal Bureau's counterintelligence methods in 1942 and 1943 were less sophisticated than they became later in the war. Early security efforts focused on obvious threats like sabotage and known enemy agents. The idea that an ordinary household worker could be a trained spy seemed improbable. This cognitive bias, this assumption that real spies looked and acted a certain way, gave Agent 7 crucial camouflage. He hid in plain sight because nobody thought to look at someone so apparently harmless. The case also raises questions about what the Germans did with the intelligence they received. Did Agent 7's photographs influence operational decisions? Did his information help German planners anticipate Allied moves? The historical record provides no clear answers. German military archives show that their intelligence services provided remarkably accurate assessments of American industrial capacity during the war. They knew how many aircraft, tanks, and ships were being produced. They understood Allied logistics better than the Allies expected. Some of this knowledge certainly came from Agent 7. How much it mattered in actual combat operations remains debatable. What is not debatable is that a security breach of extraordinary magnitude occurred at the highest levels of American government. A German spy photographed classified documents inside the White House. He transmitted intelligence to Berlin through a network that successfully evaded detection. He was caught only because of British help and American persistence. His network dissolved before it could be mapped. His identity died with him. The failure was absolute. J. Edgar Hoover's decision to bury the case rather than expose it made political sense at the time. Public disclosure would have damaged morale. It would have revealed vulnerabilities. It would have prompted questions about whether other spies remained undetected. But the secrecy also prevented the government from learning important lessons. If the case had been examined openly, security procedures might have improved faster. Other agencies might have recognized similar vulnerabilities in their own operations. The price of secrecy was ignorance. The 1997 declassification happened almost by accident. A bureaucratic error released files that should have remained sealed. By the time officials realized the mistake, researchers had already copied the documents. The government could not recall information that had entered the public domain. They could only classify what remained in their archives. The partial disclosure created a strange situation where some aspects of the case were public knowledge while other details remained hidden. This incomplete picture fueled speculation and conspiracy theories. Some researchers believe the truly damaging information is still classified. Others think the declassified files contain everything important, and the remaining secrets are simply embarrassing rather than explosive. The Agent 7 case stands as a reminder that espionage during World War II was far more complex than popular narratives suggest. We remember the successful intelligence operations like Bletchley Park and the Manhattan Project. We remember the famous double agents and the strategic deceptions. But we forget or never learn about the failures. We forget that the enemy also had skilled operatives who penetrated Allied security. We forget that some of those operatives were never caught or identified. We forget that the war was fought not just on battlefields, but in the hidden places where information moved and secrets were kept. Agent 7 knew this. He understood that intelligence was power. He understood that the real war was the struggle to know what the enemy was planning while keeping your own plans hidden. For 2 years, he won that struggle. He collected secrets. He sent them home. He stayed invisible. Only luck and British code breakers finally exposed him. And even then, he escaped final accountability by dying before anyone could learn the full truth. The White House has changed enormously since 1944. Security is now multi-layered and sophisticated. Background checks are exhaustive. Electronic surveillance monitors every corner. The idea that a janitor could photograph classified documents in a bathroom stall seems absurdly primitive. Modern security professionals look at the Agent 7 case and shake their heads at how much has changed. But human nature has not changed. The vulnerabilities that Agent 7 exploited still exist in different forms. Trusted insiders with access to sensitive areas, bureaucratic systems that prioritize efficiency over security, the assumption that ordinary workers are not threats, the cognitive bias that makes us overlook what does not fit our expectations. These weaknesses persist. The methods change, but the fundamental problem remains the same. How do you protect secrets when hundreds or thousands of people need access to do their jobs? Agent 7 had no special powers. He was not a superhuman operative. He was simply a well-trained professional who understood his environment and exploited its weaknesses. He used patience instead of boldness. He collected small things instead of attempting dramatic theft. He stayed invisible instead of seeking glory. These qualities made him extraordinarily dangerous. They also made him nearly impossible to catch. The Federal Bureau agents who searched Wilhelm Schneider's rented room in a Washington boarding house found almost nothing. The room contained a narrow bed, a small desk, a wardrobe with work clothes, and personal items so generic they could have belonged to anyone. No photographs, no letters, no diaries. The landlady remembered him as quiet and punctual with his rent. He kept to himself. He never had visitors. He left for work early and returned late. She could not recall a single conversation of substance in the 2 years he had lived there. But one agent noticed something odd about the desk. The wood showed wear patterns suggesting someone had written there frequently, pressing hard enough to leave faint impressions in the surface. The agent dusted the desk with graphite powder to reveal the impressions. Beneath the powder appeared fragments of words in German, mathematical notations, grid coordinates. The impressions were too faint to read completely, but they proved Schneider had been writing encoded messages in his room. He had been careful to destroy the papers, but had not considered that the writing itself would leave traces. The coordinates meant nothing to the initial investigators. They photographed the impressions and sent copies to Army intelligence for analysis. Cryptographers spent weeks trying to determine what system Schneider had used. The numbers did not match any known German military grid. They did not correspond to geographic locations in Europe or America. They appeared to be some kind of reference system, but for what purpose remained unclear. Then, in November 1944, a breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A code breaker at Arlington Hall, the Army Signals Intelligence Facility, noticed that some of the number sequences matched patterns in intercepted German messages from 1943. Those messages had never been fully decoded because the cipher system was unfamiliar. But if the numbers were references rather than encrypted text, they might point to a physical codebook somewhere. The Germans used codebooks for their most sensitive communications. Each number sequence corresponded to a specific word or phrase in the book. Without the physical book, breaking the code was nearly impossible. The realization changed the investigation's focus. If Schneider had been using a codebook system, where was the book itself? The search of his room had found nothing resembling a codebook. Federal Bureau agents returned to the boarding house and searched more thoroughly. They pulled up floorboards. They examined the walls for hidden compartments. They checked the plumbing for concealed spaces. They found nothing. Either Schneider had hidden the codebook somewhere outside his room, or he had memorized the entire system, which seemed implausible. Investigators began retracing Schneider's movements outside of work. The landlady mentioned he sometimes took walks in the evening. A grocery store clerk remembered him as a regular customer who bought simple meals. A librarian at a public library recalled seeing him occasionally, though she could not remember what books he read. The pattern suggested a man who lived a deliberately unremarkable life. He went to work, he came home, he performed the minimal social interactions required to avoid suspicion. Nothing more. But the library mention triggered a thought. Public libraries were perfect for covert communications. They were open to everyone. They had private reading areas. Books could be left on shelves with notes hidden inside. Federal agents visited the library branch the landlady had mentioned. They asked the staff if they remembered anything unusual about Schneider's visits. One librarian recalled that he often sat in the reference section reading almanacs and statistical abstracts. She thought it odd for a maintenance worker to spend time with such dry material, but she had not questioned it. The reference section contained hundreds of volumes. Any one of them could serve as a codebook if both sender and receiver knew which edition to use. The agents searched through every almanac and statistical abstract, looking for markings or annotations. They found nothing obvious. But when they examined the checkout records, they discovered something interesting. 3 different almanacs had been checked out multiple times during 1943 and 1944. 2 by Wilhelm Schneider. 1 by a woman who gave an address that turned out to be false. The Federal Bureau now had evidence of another member of the network, a woman who had used the library's reference books, possibly for the same purpose as Schneider. The checkout card showed she had borrowed the almanac 4 times, always returning it within a week. The dates corresponded roughly to periods when Schneider had traveled to New York for his supposed family visits. The pattern suggested coordination. She would check out the book. He would check out the same book. They would both have access to identical code books without ever meeting or communicating directly. Investigators tried to trace the woman through the false address. The building she had listed existed, but no one there had heard of her. The name on the checkout card was Mary Sullivan, so common as to be useless for identification. The library staff could not remember what she looked like. She had been unmemorable, just like Schneider. The network had trained all its members in the art of invisibility. The almanac itself revealed nothing at first inspection. It was a standard reference volume published in 1941, containing population statistics, economic data, agricultural production figures, and similar information. But a cryptographer examining the book noticed something clever. Certain tables had minor errors. A population figure would be off by a few dozen. A production total would not match other published sources. These errors were deliberate. They created unique markers that distinguished this specific edition from others. Anyone with the identical almanac could use the errors as a verification system to ensure they were using the correct codebook. The Federal Bureau purchased every copy they could find of that almanac edition. They compared them page by page. Most copies were identical, but 3 showed the same unusual pattern of errors. Someone had systematically altered multiple copies of the almanac before they were distributed. This required access either to the publisher or to a warehouse where books were stored before sale. The investigation traced the almanac's distribution network, but hit another dead end. The publisher had gone out of business in 1943. Their records had been destroyed in a warehouse fire. Whether the fire was accidental or deliberate, no one could say. While the Federal Bureau chased leads through libraries and bookstores, Army intelligence focused on what the intercepted messages revealed about the scope of Agent 7's intelligence gathering. The decoded fragments suggested he had been providing information not just from White House waste bins, but from multiple government facilities across Washington. Production figures from the War Production Board, shipping schedules from the Maritime Commission, research priorities from the Office of Scientific Research and Development, diplomatic communications from the State Department. The breadth was staggering. This raised an obvious question. How could a White House janitor access materials from so many different agencies? The initial theory that he simply collected trash from various offices no longer made sense. Trash from the Maritime Commission did not end up in White House waste bins. Documents from the Office of Scientific Research and Development were generated and destroyed in completely different buildings. Agent 7 had either found a way to access multiple facilities, or he was working with accomplices who provided materials from other locations. The second theory seemed more likely, a network rather than a lone operative. Multiple people in different positions collecting pieces of information and funneling it to a central handler. Agent 7 might have been that handler. His White House position gave him a plausible reason to be in Washington and access to high-value intelligence. But he depended on others to provide materials he could not obtain directly. Federal investigators began the tedious work of examining personnel records at every agency where compromised information had originated. They looked for people hired around the same time as Schneider. They looked for refugees with minimal documentation. They looked for employees in positions that gave them access to classified waste or document reproduction. The list of potential suspects grew to over 200 names. Investigating each one thoroughly would take months. Then, in January 1945, the investigation received an unexpected break. A secretary at the War Production Board contacted the Federal Bureau with information. She had been cleaning out file cabinets and found copies of production reports that should have been destroyed months earlier. The copies were carbon paper impressions so faint they were barely readable, but they should not have existed at all. Carbon paper used for classified documents was supposed to be burned immediately after use. Someone had been keeping the carbons instead of destroying them. The Federal Bureau interviewed the secretary at length. She explained that her office generated multiple copies of weekly production reports using carbon paper. The top copy went to senior officials. Additional copies went to various departments. The carbon paper itself was supposed to go directly into a burn bag for immediate destruction. But she had noticed that the burn bags sometimes seemed lighter than they should be. She had mentioned this to her supervisor months earlier, but had been told not to worry about it. Secretaries were not responsible for security procedures. Investigators asked who had access to the carbon paper before it was burned. The secretary listed several people: office clerks who collected trash, janitors who emptied burn bags, mailroom staff who distributed documents, security officers who supervised classified waste disposal. Any of them could have been taking carbon paper instead of burning it. The faint impressions would be nearly invisible at first glance, but could be enhanced through chemical treatment. Someone with basic photographic knowledge could turn those faint carbons into readable copies. The Federal Bureau quietly identified every person who had handled classified waste at the War Production Board during 1943 and 1944. They ran background checks on all of them. Most were long-term government employees with clean records, but 3 had been hired during the wartime expansion with minimal vetting. 2 had quit their jobs in August 1944, right around the time of Schneider's arrest. The 3rd had died in September 1944 from carbon monoxide poisoning in his apartment, ruled accidental by police. The timing was too perfect to ignore. 2 members of the network had fled. 1 had been eliminated, possibly because he knew too much or was considered a security risk. The German intelligence apparatus had moved decisively to protect itself. The Federal Bureau tried to locate the 2 who had quit. 1 had supposedly moved to Chicago but left no forwarding address. The other claimed to be returning to family in Minnesota, but no family could be found. Both had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Investigators examined the dead man's background more carefully. His name was listed as Robert Hayes, age 37, originally from Philadelphia. He had worked as a file clerk at the War Production Board for 18 months. His job gave him access to document reproduction equipment and classified waste disposal. Co-workers described him as competent but distant. He kept to himself. He never socialized. He left work precisely at 5 o'clock every day and went home alone. The description matched the profile of other network members: invisible, unmemorable, professionally competent, but socially withdrawn. Hayes had been found dead in his apartment on September 19, 1944. The building superintendent discovered him after neighbors complained about a smell. Police determined he had fallen asleep with a gas heater running in a poorly ventilated room. Carbon monoxide built up overnight and killed him. The death appeared accidental, but the Federal Bureau investigators noticed something suspicious. Hayes had lived in that apartment for over a year. The gas heater had been inspected and approved as safe just 2 months earlier. For carbon monoxide to accumulate fatally, something would have needed to malfunction badly, or someone would have needed to tamper with the ventilation. The Bureau exhumed Hayes's body in February 1945. A careful autopsy revealed carbon monoxide poisoning, but also traces of chloral hydrate, a powerful sedative. Someone had drugged Hayes before exposing him to carbon monoxide. The death was not accidental. It was murder staged to look like an accident. The killer had been skilled enough to fool the initial police investigation. Only the timing raised suspicions that prompted the exhumation. This discovery confirmed what investigators had suspected. The German intelligence network was ruthlessly eliminating anyone who might compromise operational security. 3 people dead in New York immediately after Schneider's arrest. Hayes murdered 6 weeks later in Washington. The pattern suggested a cleanup operation directed by someone who knew the full network structure. That person was still at large, That person had been willing to kill multiple agents to protect the larger apparatus. Federal Bureau leadership faced a difficult decision. They could continue investigating quietly, hoping to identify more network members before they fled or were eliminated. Or they could go public with what they knew, accepting that publicity would drive remaining agents underground, but might pressure them into making mistakes. J. Edgar Hoover chose continued secrecy. He believed the network still had members in place who could be identified if investigators worked carefully. Public disclosure would end any chance of finding them. But the secrecy strategy was failing. Every lead ended in death or disappearance. Every potential witness had either fled or been silenced. The investigation was chasing ghosts. Hoover refused to admit defeat, but agents working the case grew increasingly frustrated. They were collecting evidence of a massive intelligence failure, but seemed powerless to prevent further damage. In March 1945, Army intelligence informed the Bureau that they had decoded enough of the intercepted German messages to understand the scope of information Agent 7's network had provided. The intelligence haul included detailed assessments of American industrial capacity, shipping schedules for transatlantic convoys, research priorities for weapons development, strategic discussions between Roosevelt and Churchill. Some of the intelligence was old enough that its compromise no longer mattered tactically, but some was current enough to have operational value. The Germans knew what the Allies were planning in some cases weeks before operations began. The most damaging compromise involved atomic weapons research. Several decoded messages referenced American efforts to develop a new explosive of unprecedented power based on uranium fission. The Germans knew the Allies were pursuing atomic weapons. They knew rough timelines. They knew which laboratories were involved. The Manhattan Project's existence was supposed to be the most closely guarded secret of the war. Agent 7's network had penetrated even that. Army intelligence conducted an urgent review of Manhattan Project security. They found the breach point almost immediately. A junior administrator at the Office of Scientific Research and Development had access to funding requests and project summaries. She prepared budget documents that listed laboratories receiving money for classified research. The documents did not explicitly mention atomic weapons, but anyone analyzing the funding patterns could deduce that something enormous was happening in nuclear physics. The administrator had been hired in January 1943. She resigned abruptly in August 1944. She was one of the 2 War Production Board employees who had disappeared. The Federal Bureau now had confirmation that Agent 7's network included at least one person with access to information about the Manhattan Project. Whether the Germans had fully understood what they were learning remained unclear. German atomic research had not progressed as far as Allied efforts, partly because Hitler considered nuclear physics Jewish science and had diverted resources elsewhere. But if the intelligence from Agent 7's network had prompted Germany to take atomic weapons more seriously, the consequences could have been catastrophic. Investigators tried to determine whether other Manhattan Project facilities had been compromised. They reviewed personnel files for everyone with access to classified information. They looked for the same patterns: recent hires, minimal backgrounds, refugees with questionable documentation. They found dozens of people who fit the profile, but most had legitimate reasons for their backgrounds and had been thoroughly vetted before receiving clearances. Paranoia was not a substitute for evidence. The Bureau needed proof, not suspicion. In April 1945, as the war in Europe entered its final weeks, the investigation took another unexpected turn. American troops overran a German intelligence facility near Munich and captured files that had not been destroyed before the retreat. Among the documents were communications between Berlin and a network designated Kreuzung, which meant crossing or intersection in German. The Kreuzung network appeared to be Agent 7's operation. The captured files contained operational summaries, but almost no identifying information about individual agents. The Germans had kept their sources compartmentalized to the point where even their own headquarters did not know everyone involved. But one document proved extremely valuable. It was a damage assessment written in February 1945 after the network's collapse. The assessment acknowledged that primary source Weiss had been compromised in August 1944. Weiss meant white in German, possibly a reference to the White House. The assessment stated that 4 secondary sources had been successfully exfiltrated to neutral territory. 2 tertiary sources had been terminated per protocol. 3 cutout contacts remained in place, but had been instructed to cease all activity indefinitely. The network would remain dormant until hostilities concluded. The Federal Bureau analyzed this document extensively. 4 agents exfiltrated meant 4 people had escaped the United States entirely. They had not simply disappeared into American cities under new identities. They had left the country, probably to Argentina or Spain, where German intelligence maintained stations. 2 agents terminated meant 2 people killed to protect operational security. That matched the deaths of Robert Hayes and one of the New York contacts. 3 cutouts remaining in place meant 3 American citizens or residents who were facilitating intelligence operations, but were not German agents themselves. These would be sympathizers or people who had been manipulated into helping without understanding the full picture. Identifying the cutouts became the investigation's new priority. These were people who had provided services to the network, possibly unwittingly. They might include the printer who had altered the almanac editions. They might include travel agents who had arranged transportation. They might include landlords who had rented rooms without asking questions. Any of them might have information that could help identify the exfiltrated agents or shed light on how the network operated. Investigators compiled lists of service providers who had contact with known or suspected network members. They looked for anyone who had done business with Wilhelm Schneider, Robert Hayes, or the mysterious Mary Sullivan from the library. The lists grew enormous. In a city like wartime Washington, thousands of people provided services to government workers. Tracking down every shop owner, landlord, and merchant who might have dealt with network members would take years. But sometimes investigations get lucky. In May 1945, as Germany surrendered and the war in Europe ended, a print shop owner in Baltimore contacted the Federal Bureau with information. He had read a newspaper article about the government seeking information on suspicious printing jobs during the war years. He remembered a strange order from 1942, A man had brought in a box of almanacs and asked to have specific pages reprinted with small changes to the numbers. The customer said he was correcting errors before distributing the books to libraries. The print shop owner had thought it unusual, but not necessarily suspicious. The customer paid in cash and collected the books the same day. The print shop owner could not remember what the customer looked like. He had not kept records of the transaction because it was a cash job, but he still had the printing plates he had made for the corrected pages. Federal investigators examined the plates and confirmed they matched the error patterns in the almanac editions used as code books. This was the smoking gun. Someone had deliberately created false editions of the almanac to serve as encryption keys. The printer was an unwitting cutout, a service provider who had no idea he was helping a spy network. Investigators showed the printer photographs of Wilhelm Schneider, Robert Hayes, and several other suspects. He could not identify any of them with certainty. The customer had been average height, average build, spoke English with no noticeable accent, and had behaved like any other customer. Another ghost, another invisible operator who left no impression on memory. But the printer's testimony proved that the network had used sophisticated tradecraft. They had not relied on existing code books. They had created their own, using a legitimate business to manufacture the tools they needed. This level of sophistication worried Federal Bureau leadership. A network capable of custom-making encryption systems was more dangerous than one that relied on standard intelligence procedures. It suggested professional training at the highest level. It suggested extensive resources and planning. It suggested that Agent 7's operation might have been just one part of a larger German intelligence presence in the United States. If that was true, how many other networks existed undetected? J. Edgar Hoover ordered a comprehensive review of all counterintelligence cases from 1939 onward. Analysts looked for patterns that might indicate additional networks. They found several suspicious cases that had never been fully resolved. Classified leaks that had no identified source, document thefts that seemed too professional to be random, industrial accidents at defense plants that might have been sabotage. The evidence was circumstantial but disturbing. German intelligence had been far more active in America than anyone had wanted to admit. In June 1945, the Federal Bureau received information from British intelligence that added another dimension to the Agent 7 case. British code breakers had intercepted messages between Berlin and Buenos Aires in early 1945 discussing the exfiltration of agents from North America. The messages used code names rather than real identities, but one of the code names was Sieben, German for 7. British analysts believed this referred to Agent 7 himself. But Wilhelm Schneider was dead. Or was he? The Federal Bureau reopened the question of Schneider's death. They reviewed the medical examiner's report. They interviewed the guards who had found the body. They examined the facility's security logs. Everything appeared legitimate. A prisoner had died of apparent heart failure. The body had been cremated per standard procedure for classified detainees, but no one had thought to verify the body's identity through fingerprints or other means before cremation. Everyone assumed the dead man was Wilhelm Schneider, because he had been the only prisoner in that cell. What if someone had substituted another body? What if Schneider had been removed from the facility alive and replaced with a corpse that roughly matched his description? The scenario seemed far-fetched, but not impossible. The detention facility was a converted warehouse with minimal security. Guards were junior personnel who had not been fully briefed on the prisoner's importance. A well-planned substitution might have succeeded. The Federal Bureau investigated every person who had worked at the detention facility in October 1944. They found that 2 guards had quit within days of Schneider's reported death. One had moved to Texas and could not be located. The other had died in a car accident in Virginia in December 1944. Another convenient death. Another elimination of someone who knew too much. The pattern was unmistakable. The network had reached into the detention facility itself and extracted their operative. If Wilhelm Schneider had escaped rather than died, he would have needed new identity documents and a way out of the country. German intelligence maintained rat lines through Argentina for extracting agents. The route typically went from the United States to Mexico, then by ship to Buenos Aires. From Argentina, agents could either remain in hiding or eventually make their way back to Germany. Dozens of Nazi officials used these rat lines after the war ended. An intelligence operative like Schneider would have had access to the same networks. Federal investigators contacted their counterparts in Mexico and Argentina. They provided descriptions of Schneider and asked for any records of suspicious border crossings in late 1944. Mexican authorities reported that dozens of German nationals and refugees had crossed into Mexico during that period, many with questionable documentation. The wartime chaos made it impossible to track specific individuals retroactively. Argentine authorities were even less helpful. Their government had been sympathetic to Germany throughout the war. They had no interest in helping American investigators hunt for German agents who had taken refuge in Buenos Aires. The investigation was again reaching a dead end. Every lead dissolved into uncertainty. Every witness was dead or disappeared. Every document trail had been deliberately obscured. The network had been dismantled so thoroughly that reconstructing it seemed impossible. Agent 7, whether dead or alive, had become untouchable. By July 1945, the Federal Bureau had spent nearly a year investigating the case. They had identified one certain spy, Wilhelm Schneider, or whoever he really was. They had found evidence of at least 6 other network members. They had documented serious security breaches at multiple government agencies. They had learned that German intelligence had created sophisticated systems for collecting and transmitting classified information. But they had not arrested anyone besides the original suspect. They had not recovered any codebooks or encryption systems. They had not identified the network's American sympathizers. By any objective measure, the investigation was a failure. J. Edgar Hoover faced mounting pressure to produce results. Senior military officials wanted to know how badly security had been compromised. They wanted assurance that no other networks were operating. Hoover could not provide that assurance. The best he could offer was that the known network had been disrupted and its members had either fled the country or gone dormant. That was not good enough for officers who were planning the occupation of Japan and dealing with new intelligence challenges in the emerging Cold War with the Soviet Union. In August 1945, as the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan surrendered, the Agent 7 investigation was quietly closed. Hoover ordered the files sealed under national security classification for 75 years. No public disclosure would be made. No press release would acknowledge that a security breach had occurred. The handful of officials who knew about the case were instructed never to discuss it. The investigation had failed to achieve its objectives, and the failure would remain hidden. But the impact of Agent 7's intelligence collection continued to ripple through classified channels. Military historians reviewing German decision-making during the war found evidence that Berlin had unusually accurate assessments of American capabilities. Some German generals had argued against certain operations because they understood how much material the Allies could bring to bear. Those accurate assessments had come from somewhere. Agent 7's reports had likely influenced high-level strategic thinking in ways that could never be fully documented because German command archives were destroyed or captured by the Soviets. The Manhattan Project's security review concluded that German intelligence had known about American atomic research, but had not understood its significance quickly enough to affect the war's outcome. If Germany had taken the intelligence more seriously in 1943 or early 1944, they might have accelerated their own atomic program. But Hitler's ideological biases and resource constraints made that unlikely. The atomic secret had been compromised, but not fatally. That conclusion brought little comfort to American officials who understood how close the margin had been. The Federal Bureau maintained a small file on Agent 7 after the official investigation closed. Agents continued to monitor for any signs that network members might resurface. They tracked German refugees entering the United States in the post-war years. They investigated suspicious deaths or disappearances that might connect to the case. They found nothing definitive. The network had gone to ground so effectively that it might as well have never existed. In the 1950s, as Cold War tensions escalated and the Soviet Union became America's primary adversary, the Agent 7 case was briefly reopened. Federal investigators wondered whether any of the German network members had been recruited by Soviet intelligence. The Soviets were aggressive about finding and turning German agents who had worked against the Allies. An operative with Agent 7's skills and experience would have been valuable to Moscow. Investigators looked for evidence that former network members were working for the Soviets. They found suspicious patterns, but nothing conclusive. The ghosts remained ghosts. The decades passed slowly for those who knew about Agent 7. J. Edgar Hoover carried the secret until his death in 1972. The handful of Federal Bureau agents who had worked the case retired one by one, taking their memories into silence. A few wrote private memoirs that their families locked away. The official files remained sealed in a classified archive where only a small number of people with special clearances could access them. For 50 years, the story stayed buried. Then, in 1997, a researcher named David Marsh was working through newly declassified Federal Bureau documents at the National Archives. Marsh was writing a dissertation on wartime counterintelligence operations. He had requested access to files from the 1940s that had recently been released under automatic declassification rules. Most of what he received was routine: standard surveillance reports on suspected sympathizers, background checks on government employees, investigations that went nowhere. But one folder caught his attention because it should not have been there. The folder was labeled Household Security Assessment, with a date from August 1944. Someone in the declassification process had stamped it for release without reading the contents carefully. Marsh opened it, expecting mundane information about White House maintenance procedures. Instead, he found 37 pages describing a German intelligence operation inside the White House itself. He read through the file twice, certain he was misunderstanding something. Surely a German spy operating inside the White House would be well-known history. Surely this would have been taught in every intelligence studies course. But Marsh had never heard of Agent 7. Nobody had. He brought the file to his dissertation advisor, a retired Central Intelligence Agency officer who had worked counterintelligence during the Cold War. The advisor examined the documents and went pale. He recognized J. Edgar Hoover's signature on several memos. He recognized classification markings that indicated the highest level of sensitivity. He realized immediately that Marsh had stumbled onto something that was never supposed to become public. The advisor made 2 phone calls. Within 6 hours, Federal Bureau officials appeared at the archives and seized the file. They told Marsh the documents had been released in error and were being reclassified. They warned him that discussing classified information could result in prosecution. Then they left. But Marsh had already made copies. He was a graduate student, not an intelligence professional. He understood he had found something important, but did not fully grasp the political implications. He shared the copied documents with other researchers in his field. Within weeks, several academic historians had read the Agent 7 file. They began asking questions. They submitted Freedom of Information Act requests for related documents. They contacted retired Federal Bureau agents who might have knowledge of the case. The secret was out. The Federal Bureau responded with damage control. They acknowledged that a security incident had occurred at the White House during World War II. They confirmed that a household staff member had been arrested on suspicion of espionage. They stated that the individual had died in custody before prosecution could proceed. They declined to provide further details, citing national security concerns and privacy protections. The official statement was brief and uninformative. It raised more questions than it answered. Journalists picked up the story. Major newspapers ran articles about the White House spy case that had been hidden for 50 years. They interviewed historians who had seen the declassified documents. They contacted the families of Federal Bureau agents who had worked the investigation. Some of those families still had private papers and letters that shed additional light on the case. The outline of the story emerged in public for the first time. A German spy named Wilhelm Schneider had photographed classified documents inside the White House for 2 years. He had been caught in 1944. He had died in custody under suspicious circumstances. His network had never been fully identified or dismantled. Public reaction was mixed. Some people were shocked that German intelligence had penetrated the White House so successfully. Others were angry that the government had concealed the security failure for decades. Still others questioned whether the whole story was even true. Maybe it was disinformation. Maybe it was exaggerated. Maybe Wilhelm Schneider had been a minor figure whose importance had been inflated by bureaucratic paranoia. Without access to the complete files, outsiders could only speculate. The Federal Bureau maintained their position. The case remained classified in its entirety. The documents that had been accidentally released were again sealed. No further information would be disclosed. National security and investigative techniques needed protection even 50 years later. But the damage had been done. Researchers knew the case existed. They knew enough details to keep digging, and some of them had connections in foreign intelligence services who might have their own records. In 1998, a German historian working in the former East German State Security Archives found references to Agent 7 in Soviet intelligence files. After World War II, the Soviets had captured enormous quantities of German documents. Some of those documents came from intelligence services. The Soviets studied them carefully, looking for information about Western targets and techniques. A file labeled Kreuzung Netzwerk contained summaries of a German intelligence operation in the United States during the war. The file had been translated into Russian and analyzed by Soviet officers trying to understand how the Germans had organized their American networks. The Soviet analysis was surprisingly detailed. It confirmed much of what the declassified American documents had revealed. A network of agents collecting intelligence from multiple government facilities in Washington, a primary source with access to White House materials, secondary sources providing information from war production and research agencies, cutouts and sympathizers facilitating communications and support. The network had operated from approximately 1942 until it was compromised in August 1944. 4 agents had been successfully exfiltrated. 2 had been eliminated. The primary source's fate was listed as uncertain. The Soviets had not been able to determine whether Wilhelm Schneider had died in American custody or escaped. But the Soviet file contained something the American documents did not. It included an addendum written in 1947 by a Soviet intelligence officer who had interviewed German prisoners of war. One of the prisoners had worked in signals intelligence in Berlin during the war. He claimed to have handled communications from the Kreuzung network. He remembered that the primary source was not originally German. The man had been recruited before the war while studying in the United States. He had been trained in Germany and then sent back to America under a false identity. His real nationality was unclear. The Soviet officer speculated he might have been Austrian, Swiss, or possibly even American-born with German ancestry. The incomplete information frustrated the Soviets, who wanted to identify potential agents they might recruit for their own operations against the United States. This revelation changed how historians understood Agent 7. If he was not a German national, his motivation became more complex. Why would someone betray the United States for Germany? Ideology was one possibility. Some people believed in fascism or were anti-Semitic or admired German efficiency. Money was another possibility. Espionage paid well if you survived. Personal grievance was a third possibility. Perhaps Wilhelm Schneider, or whatever his real name was, had suffered some injustice that turned him against America. Without knowing his true identity, speculation was all that remained. David Marsh, the graduate student who had found the original file, made Agent 7 the subject of his doctoral dissertation. He spent 4 years researching the case using every available source. He obtained German documents through archives in Berlin. He found Soviet files through contacts in Moscow. He interviewed retired American intelligence officers who were willing to talk off the record. He compiled the most complete account of the case that existed outside classified channels. His dissertation was 600 pages long and included extensive appendices with photocopied documents. Marsh's work revealed several details that had not been public before. He identified Robert Hayes as one of the network members killed to protect operational security. He traced the almanac codebooks to a Baltimore print shop. He documented how the Federal Bureau investigation had repeatedly failed to catch anyone beyond the original suspect. He also raised disturbing questions about whether Wilhelm Schneider had actually died in custody or had been allowed to escape as part of some arrangement that was never recorded. The escape theory gained traction among researchers. Too many convenient deaths, too many missing records, too many coincidences. If Schneider had simply died of heart failure, why had there been no autopsy until researchers started asking questions decades later? Why had the body been cremated so quickly? Why had guards who were present quit their jobs immediately afterward? The pattern suggested a cover-up, but of what exactly? Maybe Schneider had provided information in exchange for his life. Maybe he had agreed to become a double agent. Maybe Federal Bureau leadership had made a deal that they could not acknowledge publicly. Another possibility was even more disturbing. Maybe Schneider had connections that protected him. Maybe someone in a position of authority had intervened to arrange his escape. Wartime Washington was full of people with divided loyalties or hidden agendas. Intelligence services from multiple countries operated in the city. Double agents were common. The lines between ally and enemy were sometimes blurred by practical considerations. If Schneider had information that certain powerful people wanted kept secret, they might have arranged his survival in exchange for his silence. These theories sounded like conspiracy nonsense to some listeners, but to others who understood how intelligence operations actually worked, they seemed plausible. Espionage was never clean or simple. Rules got broken, deals got made. People who should have been arrested walked free because they were useful to someone. The Agent 7 case had all the hallmarks of something more complicated than the official story suggested. In 2003, another piece of the puzzle emerged from an unexpected source. An elderly woman in Argentina contacted the German embassy in Buenos Aires with information about her late husband. He had died the previous year at age 88. While sorting through his belongings, she had found a small diary written in German. She could not read German herself, but recognized that the diary contained entries from the 1940s and 1950s. She thought it might be historically interesting and wanted to donate it to an archive. The German embassy forwarded the diary to historians in Berlin who specialized in wartime documents. When they examined it, they realized they had found something remarkable. The diary belonged to a man who identified himself only by the initial S. The entries described his life in Buenos Aires after fleeing the United States in late 1944. S. had worked for German intelligence during the war. He had operated in Washington under a false identity. He had been extracted just before American authorities closed in. The diary never mentioned his real name or explained exactly what intelligence work he had done. But the timeline and details matched Agent 7 perfectly. The diary entries were fragmentary and often cryptic. S. wrote about missing his work. He wrote about feeling useless in exile. He wrote about watching the war end from thousands of miles away. He expressed no regret for his espionage. He seemed to view it as professional duty. But he also expressed bitterness toward the German intelligence service that had abandoned him in Argentina with minimal support. He had expected to be treated as a valuable asset. Instead, he lived in a modest apartment and worked as a translator to support himself. One entry from June 1945 stood out. S. wrote about receiving news that his network had been completely compromised. 2 of his colleagues were dead. 4 had made it to safety. 3 cutouts had been warned to stay silent. He felt responsible for those who had died. He wondered if he had made mistakes that led to the collapse. But he also expressed pride in what they had accomplished. For 2 years, they had provided Berlin with intelligence that shaped strategic understanding of American capabilities. That mattered. That would be remembered even if their names were never known. Another entry from October 1947 was even more revealing. S. described meeting with a former German intelligence officer who had also ended up in Buenos Aires. The officer told him that their Washington operation had been one of the most successful of the war. The intelligence they provided had influenced multiple high-level decisions. German military planners had used their reports when calculating force requirements and operational timelines. The officer said S. should be proud. Then the officer made a strange comment. He said that S.'s most important contribution was not the intelligence itself, but proving that deep penetration of the American government was possible. Future services would learn from his methods. The diary contained no entries after 1952. Historians speculated that S. had either stopped writing or that subsequent volumes had been lost or destroyed. The diary's authenticity was debated extensively. Some experts believed it was genuine based on details that matched known facts about the Agent 7 case. Others argued it could be a fabrication created by someone who had read the declassified documents and wanted to add to the mystery. Without the author's real identity, verification was impossible. But the Argentine woman insisted the diary was authentic. Her late husband had owned it for as long as she had known him. They had married in 1955. He had told her he came from Switzerland and had immigrated to Argentina before the war. He worked as a translator and language instructor. He was quiet and private. He never spoke about his past in detail. She had assumed he was running from something, perhaps family troubles or financial problems. Many European immigrants in Argentina had similar stories. She had not pressed him for information. After his death, the diary was the first indication that his background might be more complicated than he had claimed. German historians tried to trace the husband's identity. His name in Argentina was Stefan Müller, common enough to make research difficult. Immigration records from the 1940s were incomplete. The Argentine government had not been rigorous about documenting new arrivals during that period. The woman provided photographs of her husband from the 1950s and 60s. Intelligence agencies in the United States, Britain, and Germany compared the photographs to known images of Wilhelm Schneider. The problem was that only 2 photographs of Schneider existed in Federal Bureau files, both taken from a distance during surveillance. The quality was poor. Facial recognition experts could not make a definitive match. Stefan Müller might have been Wilhelm Schneider, or he might have been someone else entirely. The diary revelation prompted renewed interest in the Agent 7 case. Several books were published between 2005 and 2010 examining different aspects of the story. Documentary filmmakers produced television programs about wartime espionage that featured the case prominently. Podcasters and online researchers dug through archives looking for additional clues. The case became a minor sensation among people interested in World War II history and intelligence operations. But despite all the attention, fundamental questions remained unanswered. Who was Agent 7 really? Where did he come from? What motivated him? How did his network operate in detail? What happened to the other members? The declassified documents provided a skeleton of information. The Soviet files added some meat to the bones. The diary, if authentic, gave a glimpse into the spy's mindset. But huge gaps remained. The story was incomplete. Some researchers believed the Federal Bureau still possessed files that had not been released. They submitted Freedom of Information Act requests asking for all documents related to Wilhelm Schneider and the Kreuzung network. The Bureau acknowledged that additional materials existed, but claimed they were still classified for national security reasons. Specifically, they argued that releasing information about investigative techniques and source protection methods could harm current operations. This explanation satisfied no one. Techniques from the 1940s were hardly cutting edge in the 21st century. Source protection for operations that ended 70 years ago seemed irrelevant. Critics accused the government of hiding embarrassing information rather than protecting legitimate secrets. In 2014, a Freedom of Information lawsuit forced the Federal Bureau to release additional documents. 300 pages of previously classified material were disclosed. Most of it was bureaucratic paperwork, memos between offices, budget requests for the investigation, surveillance logs that documented routine activities. But buried in the routine material were a few explosive revelations. One document was a memorandum from J. Edgar Hoover to President Franklin Roosevelt, dated September 1944. The memo informed the president that a German spy had been arrested in the White House. The memo stated that the spy had provided intelligence to Berlin for at least 18 months and possibly longer. The memo acknowledged that the security breach was severe and that the investigation had failed to identify all network members. But the memo also contained a paragraph that had been redacted in the released version. Someone had blacked out 3 sentences. No explanation was provided for the redaction. Researchers immediately focused on the redacted paragraph. What information was still too sensitive to release 70 years later? Legal challenges to force disclosure of the redacted material dragged through courts for 3 years. In 2017, a federal judge ordered the Federal Bureau to either release the redacted paragraph or provide a detailed classified justification for continued secrecy. The Bureau chose to release the paragraph rather than go through the justification process. The redacted sentences were stunning. Hoover had written that Wilhelm Schneider appeared to have received assistance from someone inside American security agencies. Surveillance of Schneider had been mysteriously called off twice during 1943. Documents that should have been in his personnel file had been removed. Security checks that should have flagged his background had been bypassed. Hoover stated that he suspected but could not prove that someone in a position of authority had been protecting the spy. The possibility of an American traitor helping Schneider was too explosive to investigate openly. Hoover had assigned his most trusted agents to pursue the matter discreetly. This revelation changed everything. Agent 7 had not operated alone or even just with his German network. He had an American accomplice. Someone in the government or security apparatus had helped him avoid detection. Who was this person? Why did they help a German spy? Were they ideologically motivated, or had they been blackmailed or bribed? Hoover's memo did not answer these questions. It only acknowledged that the problem existed. The Federal Bureau released a statement saying that the internal investigation referenced in Hoover's memo had been inconclusive. No traitor had been definitively identified. Several people had been quietly removed from sensitive positions as a precautionary measure. But without concrete evidence, no prosecutions had been pursued. The matter had been closed in 1946 with unresolved suspicions, but no proof. The statement was unsatisfying. It meant that someone who had helped a German spy had possibly remained in government service for years afterward. They might have even received a government pension. They had never been held accountable because their identity was never confirmed. Researchers began combing through personnel records of everyone who had worked in security positions during the relevant period. They looked for people who had retired suddenly or had been transferred to minor positions without clear explanation. They found dozens of candidates, but without access to the classified internal investigation files, they could not determine which, if any, of these people had been suspected by Hoover's team. The Federal Bureau refused to release those files, claiming they contained unsubstantiated accusations that would unfairly damage reputations of people who were now dead. The American accomplice theory added a new layer of paranoia to the case. If Agent 7 had help from inside the security apparatus, how many other spies had similar protection? The question became relevant to modern counterintelligence efforts. Foreign intelligence services still try to recruit insiders who can provide protection for their agents. The methods have evolved, but the fundamental vulnerability remains. Someone in a position of trust can compromise security in ways that are difficult to detect. The Agent 7 case was a historical example of a problem that continues today. Intelligence professionals who studied the case noted several lessons. First, background checks are only as good as the information available. Agent 7 had created a false identity that looked legitimate because he had stolen documentation from a real person. Modern identity verification is more sophisticated, but not foolproof. Second, routine behaviors can conceal espionage if no one is watching for patterns. Agent 7 looked like a diligent worker doing his job. His access to classified waste seemed insignificant. Only when someone specifically looked for anomalies did the pattern become visible. Third, networks are resilient. Even when one member is caught, others can escape if the network has good compartmentalization. Agent 7's arrest did not lead to catching anyone else because the network structure limited what he knew about other members. These lessons were incorporated into training for counterintelligence officers. The Agent 7 case became a teaching example. New recruits learned about it as a demonstration of how espionage actually works versus how movies portray it. Real spies are not glamorous. They are patient. They exploit mundane vulnerabilities. They hide in plain sight. Agent 7 had done all of this successfully for 2 years. That made him a better teacher than any fictional character. But beyond the professional lessons, the case raised philosophical questions about secrecy and democracy. Should the government be allowed to hide its failures from the public? National security sometimes requires secrecy, but accountability also matters in a democratic system. The Agent 7 case was hidden for 50 years not because disclosure would harm national security, but because it would embarrass officials who had failed to prevent the breach. That was not a legitimate reason for classification. Yet it happened anyway because the people making classification decisions had incentives to protect institutional reputations. The debate over government secrecy intensified in the 21st century as more classified documents from World War II and the Cold War became eligible for declassification. Historians argued that almost everything from that era should be public by now. The people involved were dead. The operations were finished. The techniques were obsolete. The only reason to keep secrets was to avoid embarrassment. Government agencies countered that some information remained sensitive because it revealed sources, methods, or weaknesses that could still be exploited. The argument had no clear resolution. Each side had valid points. In 2019, a curious event occurred that briefly renewed media interest in Agent 7. A man in his late 90s died in a nursing home in California. He had no living relatives. When staff cleaned out his room, they found a locked metal box among his belongings. Unable to open it and having no one to contact about the contents, they turned the box over to local police. Police opened it and found documents that appeared to be from the 1940s. The documents were in German. Police contacted federal authorities, who sent someone to examine the materials. The box contained identity papers for several different names, all with the same photograph of a young man. It contained train tickets from the 1940s connecting Washington, New York, and the Mexican border. It contained a small notebook with what appeared to be coded entries, and it contained a letter written in English addressed to whoever might find these items. The letter was unsigned. It stated that the author had served his country during the war in a capacity that could never be acknowledged. He had lived the rest of his life under a false name. He wanted someone to know that his actions had been motivated by principle, not malice. He had believed he was doing the right thing, even if history would judge him a traitor. Federal investigators examined the materials. The identity papers were professionally forged documents from the era. The notebook contained codes that matched systems used by German intelligence. The train tickets were authentic, but provided no definitive information about the traveler. The photograph in the identity papers was compared to images of Wilhelm Schneider. Facial recognition technology in 2019 was far more advanced than it had been in earlier decades. The analysis came back with an 82% probability match. Not conclusive, but highly suggestive. The nursing home staff provided information about the deceased man. He had lived there for 6 years under the name Thomas Bennett. He had paid cash for his care. He had no visitors. He rarely spoke about his past. He watched historical documentaries on television and read books about World War II. He seemed interested in intelligence history specifically. When staff asked about his background, he said he had worked in various jobs throughout his life. Nothing exciting, just an ordinary American who had lived through interesting times. Thomas Bennett's personal effects included photographs from the 1950s and 60s showing him in various locations. Buenos Aires appeared in several photos. He was shown standing in front of recognizable landmarks. The photos matched the time frame when Stefan Müller, the man from the Argentine diary, would have been living there. Was Thomas Bennett the same person as Stefan Müller? Was he Wilhelm Schneider? The probability seemed high, but could not be proven with absolute certainty. The federal government took possession of all materials found in the box. They were classified immediately. Officials stated that the items might relate to an ongoing investigation and could not be discussed publicly. That statement made no sense to outside observers. What ongoing investigation could relate to events from 75 years ago? The government's response suggested they were hiding something. Perhaps Thomas Bennett had been Wilhelm Schneider. Perhaps the Bureau had known about him for years, but had made a decision not to prosecute. Perhaps there was an agreement, a deal made decades ago that could not be acknowledged even now. The Thomas Bennett discovery was the last major development in the Agent 7 story. As of the early 2020s, researchers continue to dig through archives. New documents occasionally surface, but the core mystery remains unsolved. Who was Agent 7 really? Where did he come from? What happened to him? Multiple candidates exist. Multiple theories have been proposed, but definitive proof is lacking. Some people believe Wilhelm Schneider died in Federal Bureau custody in 1944, and everything else is speculation based on incomplete information. The diary could be a forgery. Stefan Müller could be someone else. Thomas Bennett could be an unrelated person who happened to have wartime German documents. Coincidences happen. Others believe Schneider escaped or was allowed to escape as part of a secret arrangement. He lived in Argentina for years under a false name. He eventually made his way back to the United States and lived out his life in California. He died peacefully at age 98, having never been held accountable for his wartime espionage. The Thomas Bennett materials prove this version of events, even if government officials refuse to acknowledge it. Still others believe the truth is more complicated. Maybe the man arrested as Wilhelm Schneider in 1944 was not Agent 7 at all, but a decoy or fall guy. Maybe the real mastermind was never caught. Maybe the network had multiple people in similar positions, and the Federal Bureau only discovered one of them. Maybe Agent 7 is a composite of several people whose stories have been conflated over time. Without access to complete files, speculation is all that remains. The Federal Bureau continues to maintain that additional classified materials exist that cannot be released. They cite ongoing investigative methods, source protection, and foreign relations concerns. Critics believe these justifications are pretexts for avoiding embarrassment. The argument continues with no resolution in sight. Meanwhile, the few people who might know the complete truth are dying. Every year, more veterans pass away. More intelligence officers retire and then die. The memories fade. The institutional knowledge disappears. Soon, no one will be left who has any direct connection to the case. Future historians will have to work with fragmentary evidence and incomplete records. They will do their best to reconstruct what happened. They will write careful analyses with appropriate caveats about uncertainty. They will note that some questions cannot be answered definitively. The Agent 7 case will remain a mystery, wrapped in a historical event, wrapped in government secrecy. That may be the most fitting end for a story about a spy who spent his career hiding in plain sight. What the case ultimately reveals is how little we know about intelligence operations, even from the distant past. We assume that with enough time and declassification, the truth will emerge. But that assumption may be wrong. Some secrets stay buried because the people who knew them took that knowledge to their graves. Some records were destroyed deliberately. Some files were never created because certain operations were too sensitive to document. The gaps in our knowledge are not accidental. They are structural features of how intelligence work operates. Agent 7 understood this. He operated for 2 years because he was patient, careful, and understood that invisibility was his greatest asset. He collected intelligence that looked insignificant piece by piece, but accumulated into strategic value. He used systems that were simple enough to be reliable but sophisticated enough to resist casual detection. When he was finally caught, or when he decided to disappear, he left almost no trace of his real identity. That was the mark of a professional. The people who tried to catch him also understood this. Federal Bureau investigators knew they were chasing someone skilled. They recognized the patterns. They identified the methods. But they were always several steps behind. By the time they understood what was happening, the network had already begun dismantling itself. The best agents had escaped. The vulnerable ones had been eliminated. The cutouts had been warned. The investigation found evidence of what had happened, but could not prevent the principals from slipping away. This dynamic plays out repeatedly in intelligence history. The spy operates in shadows. The investigators chase shadows. Sometimes they catch someone. More often, they find empty rooms and cold trails. Success in counterintelligence is measured not by dramatic arrests, but by preventing breaches before they occur. Once a spy has been active for months or years, the damage is done. Catching them afterward is satisfying but insufficient. The secrets are already compromised. The intelligence has already influenced decisions. The opportunity to prevent harm has passed. Agent 7's intelligence about American war production helped German planners understand what they were facing. It did not change the war's outcome because German capacity was insufficient, regardless of how well they understood Allied capabilities. But the intelligence might have influenced tactical decisions that cost Allied lives. If German commanders positioned forces more effectively because they knew where supplies were going, soldiers died who might have survived. If German aircraft targeted convoys more efficiently because they knew shipping schedules, sailors drowned who might have lived. The cost of espionage is measured in consequences that can never be fully calculated. American officials who dealt with the Agent 7 case understood these stakes. That is why they kept the breach secret. Public knowledge would have demanded accountability. Politicians would have had to explain how a German spy operated in the White House for 2 years. Military leaders would have faced questions about whether better security could have prevented the compromise. The easier path was silence. Classify everything, admit nothing, wait for time to erase the problem. That strategy succeeded for 50 years until an archival accident exposed the case. Now we know the story exists, but cannot know the story completely. We have fragments, we have hints, we have theories, we do not have certainty. Perhaps that is appropriate. Intelligence work is about operating in uncertainty. Spies work without knowing if they will be caught. Investigators pursue cases without knowing if they will succeed. Governments make decisions without knowing if their secrets are protected. The Agent 7 case exemplifies this fundamental uncertainty that characterizes the hidden conflicts between nations. The case also reminds us that history is not settled just because events are distant. New information continues to emerge. Documents get declassified, archives open. People die and leave behind materials that were hidden for decades. Each new revelation forces us to reconsider what we thought we knew. The story of Agent 7 has changed multiple times as additional information became available. It may change again if more documents surface. We should remain humble about historical conclusions. What we know today may be incomplete. What seems certain may prove uncertain. The past is not as fixed as we like to believe. For people who lived through World War II or grew up in its shadow, the Agent 7 case resonates differently than for younger generations. Those who remember the era understand the stakes in a visceral way. They remember rationing and victory gardens and families waiting for news from overseas. They remember the sense that everything depended on winning the war. The idea that an enemy spy was collecting secrets inside the White House feels like a profound betrayal. It violates the memory of sacrifice and unity. It suggests that even in the darkest time, some people chose personal agenda over national survival. Younger people view the case more abstractly. It is history, not memory. The emotional weight is different. They can appreciate the intelligence operation's sophistication without feeling personally invested in the outcome. They can discuss whether Wilhelm Schneider was justified in his actions without it seeming offensive. They can debate whether the government was right to hide the breach without feeling that secrecy betrayed public trust. The generational difference in perspective is natural. Direct experience changes how we understand events. But regardless of generation, everyone can recognize that the Agent 7 case raises timeless questions. How do we balance security and openness? How do we hold powerful institutions accountable when they fail? How do we prevent similar breaches in the future? These questions have no easy answers. They require constant negotiation between competing values. The Agent 7 case is one example of how those negotiations play out in real situations with real consequences. As the last people with direct knowledge of the case pass away, we are left with archives and analysis. The human dimension fades. The story becomes data points and declassified memos. But somewhere in those dry documents is a human story. Wilhelm Schneider, or whatever his name was, lived a life. He made choices. He took risks. He believed in something strongly enough to betray the country where he lived. What drove him? What did he think about during those 2 years of photographing documents in a bathroom stall? Did he feel pride or guilt or fear or nothing at all? We will never know because he left no testimony beyond coded messages and a diary that may or may not be authentic. The Federal Bureau agents who investigated the case also have stories. They worked long hours chasing leads that went nowhere. They felt frustrated by the limitations imposed by secrecy and bureaucracy. They knew they had failed to catch most of the network. Some probably thought about the case for the rest of their lives, wondering what they had missed, whether different choices might have led to better outcomes. Their stories are also lost now. A few wrote private accounts that may someday surface. Most took their experiences to the grave. Even the American accomplice, if such a person existed, has a story. What made someone in a position of trust decide to help a German spy? Was it ideology or money or blackmail or something else entirely? Did they regret their actions later? Did they live in fear of exposure? Did they die believing they had escaped accountability? We will likely never know. That part of the story is buried too deeply. The Agent 7 case will never be fully solved. Too much time has passed. Too many people are dead. Too many records are destroyed or remain classified. We have enough information to know the outlines of what happened. We know a German spy operated successfully inside the White House during World War II. We know he was eventually detected and arrested. We know his network included multiple people who were never caught. We know the breach was kept secret for decades. But the human details, the motivations, the complete picture of how it all worked, those remain hidden. Perhaps that is fitting for a story about espionage. Spies work in shadows. Their successes are invisible. Their failures sometimes remain hidden even after they are caught. Agent 7 achieved what every intelligence operative hopes for. He stole important secrets. He evaded detection for years. He escaped or died before he could be forced to reveal everything he knew. His true identity remains uncertain. His ultimate fate is unclear. He became a ghost story, more legend than verified history. That is a strange kind of victory, but a victory nonetheless. The people who care about World War II history and intelligence operations will continue debating the case. New books will be written, new theories will be proposed, new documents may yet surface, but the fundamental mystery will persist. Who was Agent 7? Where did he come from? What happened to him? These questions may never have definitive answers. We are left with possibilities and probabilities, not certainties. And perhaps the biggest question remains unasked. How many other Agent 7s were there? How many other spies operated in similar ways during the war and were never detected at all? How many secrets were stolen that we will never know about because the operations were so successful that they left no trace? The Agent 7 case is remarkable because it was partially exposed. But for every spy who gets caught or leaves evidence, how many operate perfectly and vanish completely? That is the question that keeps intelligence professionals awake at night. The unknown unknowns, the ghosts who move through secure facilities, collecting information, and are never seen at all. Agent 7 reminds us that those ghosts exist. They operated during World War II. They operate today. Security is never perfect. Insiders can always find ways to compromise it if they are patient and skilled. The challenge for any government or organization is to make betrayal difficult enough that most potential spies will be caught or deterred. But some will always get through. Some will collect their intelligence and disappear. Some will become legends that future historians debate without ever reaching firm conclusions. Wilhelm Schneider, Stefan Müller, Thomas Bennett, or whoever he really was, lived this reality. He spent 2 years photographing documents in a White House bathroom. He escaped or died under mysterious circumstances. He may have lived decades under false names in multiple countries. He left behind fragmentary evidence that proves he existed but does not reveal who he was. His story is incomplete by design. Spies do not leave detailed autobiographies. They do not explain themselves for posterity. They serve, they hide, they disappear. If they do their work well, they remain mysteries forever. That is what we are left with in the Agent 7 case. A mystery wrapped in classified files, wrapped in contradictory evidence. A story that is historically important, but permanently incomplete. A reminder that even in the most studied period of modern history, enormous secrets remain hidden. The past is not as known as we pretend. The archives do not contain everything. Some truths went to graves. Some records burned. Some stories will never be told because no one is left who knows them well enough to tell them accurately. Agent 7 won his personal war. He kept his secrets. He avoided accountability. He disappeared into history as a question mark rather than a known quantity. For a spy, that may be the best possible outcome. Better to be debated than exposed. Better to be mysterious than understood. Better to leave people wondering than to have every detail documented and analyzed. In his own way, Agent 7 achieved immortality, not as a hero or a villain with a clear identity, but as an enigma that will fascinate researchers for generations. That legacy, strange as it is, belongs to him alone.